Hello and welcome to part 2, 1906, Dreadnoughts from Around the World, 1905 to 1914. And I'm still joined by the Fluffy Research Assistant, so the window is still open. But he's currently on cat patrol, aren't we? Yes, cat patrol. I'm sorry, those naughty kitties come into your garden, don't they? And they just don't pay you the attention. They don't pay you the respect you deserve. Anyway. 1906. It's a good year. So it's when we have to start discussing, and the whole way through these, I've got spread out little things which I'm going to be talking about, and one of them is the placement of turrets. Now, as you'll see, that is von der Tann. And the other one is HMS Agincourt. There's lots of various ways of going around and placing your turrets. There's also a lovely quote I've found in Conway's All the World Fighting Ships, which is, well, theoretically, the Rivadavia, and this is one of the Argentinian ships, has a head and a stern fire of 6 guns. This is not so in reality, as it's almost certain that the blasts from the waist turrets would dish in the smoke pipes and damage the uptakes. Now, as I said before earlier when talking about HMS Dreadnought, really, if you're firing forward or aft from the wing turrets, you're only firing the outer, whatever is the outer gun. Because if you fire the inner ones, you're going to cause a lot of damage to your ship. And there are various approaches which come across. That you have what's happened with von der Tann, where someone's decided, you know what, a USS Texas was actually a really good idea. I really like that. And so what I'm going to do is I'm going to replicate that, but add a forward and an aft gun, and yeah, it's going to be brilliant, because this will mean we'll be able to fire at least, 6 guns at anyone. Doesn't really work that well. Not really something I'd recommend, and you really don't want to be firing a broadside across your ship, because it's a good way to cause a lot of damage to your deck plating and the stuff underneath your deck, and any humans who happen to be, I don't know, anywhere near the deck and near your top deck. It's just no. And then you of course have HMS Agincourt, which is a thing of going, how many turrets can we fit on a ship? Now, I think we can all agree that 7 is a very interesting number, but what does that reality give her? Well, theoretically, it gives her a broadside of 14 guns, but there are various theories about what would happen if she actually fired all 14 simultaneously. So, usually what she does is she fires odds and evens in the turrets. So you'd have 1, 3, 5, and 7 fire, and then 2, 4, and 6 fire. Which probably made sense. But you also have a scenario that if you were trying to come at her from pretty much any angle, thanks to having the centerline guns, unless you're directly forward or directly aft, she can usually bring a lot more than 4 guns to bear on you. And in fact, with only a little bit of maneuvering, she can probably bring most of her 14 guns to focus in your direction. That's important. And at no point will she be firing across her whole deck and possibly ripping her whole ship apart. Sorry, I have great respect for von der Tann. It does well, but no. Anyway, what do the British do? They've just built Dreadnought. Amazing! Everyone's going, oh, let's see how that works. And most other people are going, Let's think about this. That's a lot of new equipment in one ship. We need to digest this. Jackie Fisher, for all his many quirks, good points, bad points, personality problems, possible various illnesses, and dancing, jumped straight into, well, we are a maritime nation, a maritime empire. Having a strong battle fleet is great. But we need to be able to secure our trade around the world. And there is a very simple reason why it's a single HMS Dreadnought and then it's 3 battle cruisers. He orders. Because, simply put, trade matters more. Winning battles he can do. As mentioned in 1905, and will be mentioned again in this one, the British have a huge number of pre-Dreadnought battleships. They can form a colossal fleet, and they're the only ones in the world with a Dreadnought battleship. And by the way, they are still building pre-Dreadnoughts. They don't need to worry about battle fleet strength. They really don't. Dreadnought is not a example of a nation worrying it's going to get, taken over and it's fighting for its life and it needs to suddenly innovate to give itself a technological edge. It's a very nice experiment. A very viable experiment, it turns out. But it's a test bed. It's not something which Britain's dependent upon for its survival. However, they are dependent on freedom of the seas and movement of trade for their survival. And that means surface raiders, in whatever form they come, are a threat. And if you think about it, who's advising the Royal Navy this time? It's Julian Corbett, etc. And what does Corbett talk about in lots of his books? He talks about the effect of the Commerce War, La Guerre de Corse, on the British war effort in Napoleonic Wars and the British economic warfare and cruising and frigates on the French war effort. And then you go, Britain's a maritime trading empire. The Suez Canal is not something the British consider a nice place to go. They consider it a critical national asset. The Falkland Islands, critical coaling station, Cape Colony. Most of the British Empire has come about because of Britain seeking places to trade and coal its ships. However, I would like to point it out. Yes, I was being rude about Von der Tann earlier, but I will now be rude about the Invincible class battlecruisers because, oh my lord, no. Again, if you're firing forward or aft, inner guns don't fire on the wing turrets. Not unless you want to cause yourself damage. But the good thing about this is there is no way, thanks to that superstructure, they are going to attempt in any way to fire across the ship. Because you think about it, for either of those guns to fire across the ship, they would have to turn all the way round and then eventually fire. And by the time they got to firing point, they would have such a narrow arc of potentially firing, there is no point in doing it. Which gives them a 6-gun broadside. Which is fine. You also notice that there's an interesting list there because it goes invincible, indefatigable. Well, no, invincible, indomitable, flexible, indefatigable, New Zealand and Austria. Well, yeah. Those ships are listed there because honestly, they are a bit of a continuation. They're an improvement, but they're a continuation, and we'll be talking about that later. They displace 17,500 tons, or 20,000 tons, well, nearly 21,000 tons in deep. So, not that different to good old Dreadnought. What is interesting is they have 31 water tube boilers. Remember, Dreadnought had 18, so these have gained 13, i.e., more than 60% more boilers, which gives them 41,000 shaft horsepower. Again, 4 shafts, but you need all that power to get a lighter ship up to 25 knots. A 4-knot advantage over Dreadnought. They are nice ships. But again, it's the British in many ways, causing trouble. Why? Because the British have tons of cruisers in the world. They have tons of armoured cruisers going. They're churning them out even while these are coming out. And suddenly, they're talking about a Dreadnought armoured cruiser. I haven't included the poor Blucher in all this yet. No. I honestly don't feel that like that to be that cruel. But in many ways, these ships have more of an impact than Dreadnought does. And this is coming from someone who, as we all know, is not a fan of the phrase battle cruiser. Really not. Especially not as autocorrect just keeps making my life terrible unless I have it spelled like that rather than separately. Which is how I prefer it. I might win in later slides. Because these cause trouble because for everyone else to look at Britain, Britain is already the economic maritime superpower. Whatever you want to call dominant maritime power, prime power, whatever you want to go. Let's be honest, superpower is associated with nuclear weapons, so we'll keep away from that. The preeminent global power. These might be marketed as things which Britain's going to use to protect its trade, but everyone knows they can also be used to prosecute your trade. There isn't much that's going to be able to get away from them. 25 knots? There aren't many merchant ships which can get away from that. And Britain already has cruiser advantage, so having these as well sailing around the world allows them to theoretically hoover up all your trade. And if you send out cruisers to try and protect your trade, which means you have 2 options. Either everything needs to have a heavy escort of pre-Dreadnought battleships, which again, Britain has an advantage in, which have enough firepower that, yes, this might have a chance of might be able to beat them, but it might not. And the damage it'll sustain could well put it out of action for not much benefit for you. If it's a good enough breeder or not. So, it's a brisk fleet deterrent strategy, in a way. Whatever the case, this forces nations to start looking at their trade and going, can we rely on that in war? And yes, there are countries like America who have so much potential volume internally and so much supplies and resources internally. They don't need to worry as much about external trade. But they still are dependent on external trade. Because that trade is what provides them with a lot of hard currency, which they need to invest to grow their infrastructure. And if you're a smaller power, one of the interesting things that comes up, and we'll be getting into this at some point, is the South American arms race. And the Dreadnought races, and at some point, they have better Dreadnoughts than other nations do, than America does. Well, there is a reason for that. These nations are mostly exporting raw materials, importing the materials and materials they need to grow their infrastructure. They're dependent upon maritime trade. They can't afford to be at the mercy of everyone with one of these or a heavy cruiser. Then we have the Americans. It's the South Carolina class, but you'll notice that I wouldn't call these potentially a full dreadnought. And the reason for that is vertical triple expansion steam engines. It's a whole weird setup, and honestly, it's weird. But it's weird in that I'm comparing it to HMS Dreadnought. And honestly, it's not weird in that it's a continuation of what the Americans were already building. They were looking at going for a big gun ship. This is, in a large extent, not so much a response to HMS Dreadnought as a continuation of what the Americans were already looking at. And with 2 shafts and a top speed of 18.5 knots and a range of 6,950 nautical miles at 10 knots, I honestly wouldn't have liked to have been in them if they'd ended up against HMS Dreadnought. I'm sorry. I have great respect for the Americans, and they have very good guns, all 8 of them, but these were not ships to go and fight a Dreadnought in. But conversely, I think it was sensible to build them because, again, if you go back to the Invincible class, one of these plodding along with your merchant ship convoy, I don't really want to take my battlecruiser up against it. I might win. I can dance around it and blast away, but they're a lot easier threats to deal with, a lot easier prey to go and get a find. And then we have the Bellerophon class, or as I like to call them, Dreadnought class continued. Batch 2s. 18 water tube boilers, where have you heard that before? 2 steam turbines. Ooh. A top speed of 21 knots, and a range of 5,720 nautical miles at 10 knots. Roughly the same displacement as a Dreadnought, roughly the same armor profile as a Dreadnought. They managed to get on the Royal Bank of Canada's $10 bill, which is always nice. They are, in many ways, a incremental upgrade on Dreadnought, based on some experience operating her. And the Royal Navy orders 1 of this class in 1906. The rest are ordered in 1907. Which is why, when we start to talk about this, the Royal Navy, with the 3 Invincibles and HMS Bellerophon, have got 4 Dreadnoughts under construction. Still got that huge 39 pre-dreadnoughts and two pre-dreadnoughts still under construction. America, yeah, they've got two dreadnoughts. I'm being nice with the South Carolinas. I don't consider them proper full dreadnoughts because they haven't got turbine engines and they haven't got all the things which actually are dreadnought, which make dreadnought dreadnought. From there, and everyone else is still building pre-dreadnoughts. So what's the point I'm making? It's 1906. Britain's already on not just its batch 2, but it's also other idea. America is on a sort of approaching there. And most nations are still building their insurance policies, which are the pre-dreadnoughts, which they know work. They've been using them for the last decade or so. They know they work. They've exercised them. They know they will blast away at things. This is the reality. It's not a dreadnoughts appeared. We will all build dreadnoughts. They're amazing. It's we're going to evaluate this. The British are being slightly more pushy on it, but as I explained with the Invincibles, there is a reason for that. There is a reason why they are not charging into the Bellerophon class, but they are charging into the Invincibles because of their exposure. Britain does not have this many battleships for the good of its health, because the Treasury loves to spend money. Because they are running an employment scheme by giving shipyards lots of work. No, none of that. They have it because they're looking at the balance of the books and they know what Britain's exposure is. And this is considered a sensible level of insurance. We can argue about governments today about whether or not they build in a sensible level of insurance. We can argue whether since the 1920s and the lovely naval treaties they have managed to build in a sensible level of insurance, or whether they were trying to build in the bare minimum, save money and cut the risk of war, because as we all know, when you disarm, that's the way you stop wars happening. Oh, no. Human history has shown that the good people disarm, the nice people disarm. But not everyone is good, not everyone is nice. Maybe not everyone is as trusting. And eventually, the ones who don't disarm get to do what they like. We consider, off to one side and tangent, bilge pumps. We've been through a period in the 1990s and early 2000s where a sternly worded note had a significant impact. Now we're starting to notice that the sternly worded note doesn't have an impact unless the other side believes it has an impact. If they have a strong enough military, they go, so what? In many ways, you are approaching periods of history far more like the 1930s and the 1900s and the 1890s. When, yes, you would send a sternly worded note. But to paraphrase a song, which you would also send a ship full of love to make your point. That love might be in the form of rather large, high explosive shells, but, it was fully loaded with love. It wasn't because they weren't civilized or they weren't educated or they didn't have the same ideals for a peaceful world as we do. It's because they had a very specific understanding of the realities of the world. and the 1990s and the early 2000s, the world was the way it was because it was very much unipolar, to use that lovely phraseology, in that America was beyond doubt the most powerful nation in the world. No one dared stand up to them, and therefore no one really wanted to risk it. And yes, they would turn up with their friends, mostly NATO, and they were all very powerful. Why? Because they had large militaries which were being built up as a result of the Cold War, and peace had happened, but instead of what had happened on one side, the Warsaw Pact alliance and the Soviet Union, where things had quickly fallen away, they were slowly reducing their forces because that was the economically sensible approach they followed. To slowly reduce and cut forces. They made some quite dramatic cuts quite quickly, but they were slowly going out. So they had a lot of excess military power of the most powerful military nations in the world at that time, and they were all part of the same club, all friends. If they said no, it would be backed up by military force. You knew it was there. It didn't need to come with it. You knew it was a long way away, but you knew it was coming. This time period, even Britain would send at least a small ship. But the thing was, everyone knew that small ship was a representative of that pack. And let's be honest, you could combine a lot of these nations' forces together, and you still wouldn't have a force equivalent to this. Because this will have a unified command structure, common training standards, common logistics. They will be used to working together. You suddenly put all those together without having had a lot of practice and a lot of working together and a lot of exercises and years of developing some common interfaces. Frankly, you'll just have a even larger version of what happened to the 2nd Pacific Squadron. I don't know. Hope you enjoyed this one. And as I said, what have we got coming up? We have Monsters of the Royal Navy, Section 3. We have suggestions from ADFAB, the Coastal Command in the 1920s and 1930s as well this week. It's going to be a fun week. Thank you very much. I hope you've enjoyed, and take care. Oh, and if you do like the videos, please do maybe consider subscribing. Also press the little bell down there. And if you fancy chatting, please join the Discord. There's a link down below. And if you feel like being very generous towards my book and research funding, there is Patreon. Also linked down below. And there are some lovely merchandise in the Patreon, I'm told, by people who've received it. Thank you. Take care.